Imagine standing on a shoreline where the world feels strangely quiet. The wind still moves, the waves still rise and fall, yet something is missing. No birds circle above. No insects buzz along the water's edge. The horizon stretches across an empty planet that feels abandoned long before humans ever existed. This was Earth once. "252 million years ago, long before dinosaurs walked the land, before mammals hid in burrows, and before flowers ever bloomed, life had already conquered the planet. Vast forests stretched across continents. Coral reefs thrived in shallow seas. Strange reptile-like creatures roamed dry plains under a burning sun. Insects larger than anything alive today filled the air. The world was not primitive. It was rich, stable, and ancient, and then it almost ended. Most people know about the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs. It is famous, dramatic, and easy to imagine. A rock from space falls from the sky and changes everything in a moment. But the greatest extinction in Earth's history was not sudden. It did not come from above. It came slowly, relentlessly, and from the planet itself. Scientists call it the Permian Triassic extinction. 90% of all species vanished. Entire branches of life that had survived for hundreds of millions of years disappeared forever. Oceans emptied, forests collapsed, even insects, the most resilient creatures on Earth, nearly went extinct. If you could travel to that time, you would not see a dying ecosystem, you would see a dying world. What makes this event so unsettling is not just its scale, but its silence in popular memory. No single explosion marked its beginning. No single crater marks its cause. Instead, the fossil record tells a different story. Layer by layer, rock formations reveal a slow thinning of life. Species become rare, then vanish. Whole communities disappear, replaced not by new ones, but by nothing. For a long time, scientists struggled to understand it. Early geologists noticed a strange boundary in rocks across the world. Below the line, fossils were abundant and diverse. Above it, they were sparse and simple. It looked as if the complexity of life itself had been reset. At first, researchers assumed the record must be incomplete. Surely life could not collapse so completely. But discoveries kept repeating the same pattern on every continent. China, Russia, South Africa, Europe, North America. The same sudden drop, the same biological void. The Earth had nearly sterilized itself. To understand how shocking this is, you must picture the world before the disaster. At the end of the Permian period, life had already endured multiple smaller extinctions and recovered stronger each time. Evolution had refined ecosystems over immense spans of time. Predators and prey existed in delicate balance. Coral reefs rivaled modern tropical seas. Some reptile ancestors of mammals possessed complex teeth, upright postures, and active lifestyles. Life was not experimenting anymore, it was thriving. And stability, in nature, often hides vulnerability. The supercontinent Pangaea dominated the globe. Nearly all land was fused into one vast mass, stretching from pole to pole. Its interior deserts were harsh and dry, while coastal regions teemed with life. Ocean currents circulated differently than today, distributing heat unevenly. Climate zones were extreme but predictable. Over millions of years, species adapted precisely to these conditions. The planet looked eternal. Yet buried within the rocks of that era lies evidence of subtle change. Chemical signatures began to shift. Carbon ratios altered in ways that suggested something enormous was disturbing the atmosphere. Oxygen levels in the oceans slowly declined. Certain marine species struggled long before they disappeared entirely. These were not sudden deaths. They were warning signs. Imagine a forest where leaves grow thinner each season. A reef where fewer creatures return each year. Nothing dramatic enough to alarm the inhabitants, yet unmistakably different to an observer watching over centuries. The Earth was entering a crisis measured not in days, but in geological heartbeats. No creature understood what was happening. Evolution had never prepared life for a catastrophe on this scale because nothing like it had occurred before. Asteroid impacts had struck Earth many times, but they were brief disasters. This was different. The change was continuous, compounding, and unstoppable. Temperatures began to rise gradually across the globe. At first it meant longer summers, then it meant drought. Plants adapted by shrinking leaves to conserve water. Animals migrated toward coasts and higher latitudes. Marine organisms sensitive to heat retreated into deeper waters. But the warming did not stop. As thousands of years passed, habitats shrank faster than species could evolve. Large predators required stable food chains, and those chains weakened. Herbivores struggled as plant communities transformed. Microorganisms in the oceans altered their chemistry, quietly reshaping the base of the food web. Still, life persisted. Extinction is rarely dramatic at first. It is erosion, a missing species here, a vanishing population there. Over generations, the world becomes emptier, but not obviously broken. If a human lived through centuries, they might notice fewer sounds at night, fewer tracks in the mud, fewer shapes beneath the waves. Then came the tipping point. Across geological layers, a moment appears where gradual decline becomes collapse. Entire marine ecosystems disappear almost simultaneously. Coral reefs that had lasted millions of years vanish from the fossil record. Shelled creatures that once dominated the seas fail to reappear in younger rocks. The diversity curve does not dip, it plummets. On land, the pattern repeats. Forest pollen abruptly declines, complex animal footprints vanish from sediment surfaces. For a span of time, rocks contain almost no signs of life at all. This was the closest Earth has ever come to losing complex life entirely. The planet did not become completely sterile, but it approached a threshold where recovery might have been impossible. If conditions had worsened only slightly more, evolution could have restarted from microbial beginnings. The long history leading toward animals, and eventually humans, might have ended in that silent interval. Instead, a few survivors endured in isolated refuges. Small, adaptable, and often unremarkable creatures carried the future of life within them. At the time, they would have seemed insignificant. Later, they would become ancestors of entirely new worlds. But in this moment, during the height of the catastrophe, Earth was a place of scarcity and heat. Oceans stagnated, air composition changed, ecosystems simplified into shadows of their former complexity. And the most unsettling part is that nothing external caused it. No cosmic impact, no alien invasion, no sudden astronomical alignment. The planet itself became the engine of destruction. In the following chapter, we step back into the world before the collapse, when life flourished across Pangaea and no creature could imagine the slow disaster already beginning beneath its feet. If you could walk across the Earth shortly before the catastrophe reached its peak, you might not immediately recognize that anything was wrong. The forests would still stand in many regions. Rivers would still carve through floodplains. Herds of reptile-like herbivores would still graze under a hot sun. Yet, something subtle would feel different. Life had begun to thin. Predators would roam farther between meals. Shorelines would host fewer shells than the year before. Coral reefs that once teemed with movement would appear patchy and strangely quiet. Each change alone might seem ordinary. In nature, populations rise and fall. But together, they formed a pattern stretching across the entire planet. The fossil record captures this quiet unraveling with unsettling precision. In rocks dating to the late Permian, diversity declines unevenly. Certain species disappear region by region instead of all at once. Entire ecological communities begin to fragment. It is not a sudden extinction, but a long weakening of the biosphere's structure. To understand why this matters, imagine a vast city. If one building collapses, the city survives. If entire districts slowly empty, services fail. Transportation stops. Eventually, the remaining inhabitants cannot function. Ecosystems operate the same way. They depend on countless interactions built over millions of years. When enough connections break, collapse becomes inevitable. During this time, temperatures continued rising across the supercontinent Pangaea. Its immense interior deserts expanded. Seasonal rains became unpredictable. Plants adapted where they could, but specialized species struggled first. Some forests transitioned into sparse shrublands. Wetlands shrank or vanished. The animals dependent on them followed. Near the coasts, the oceans appeared deceptively stable. Waves still rolled onto beaches, and tides still followed the moon. Beneath the surface, however, chemistry was changing. Oxygen levels in seawater were declining, especially in deeper regions. Marine animals that relied on well-oxygenated environments began retreating toward shallower zones. This created overcrowding. In certain fossil beds, scientists find many species compressed into smaller habitats shortly before their disappearance. Creatures that once occupied separate ecological niches were forced into competition. Predators hunted prey already weakened by environmental stress. The struggle for survival intensified while the environment continued deteriorating. Then the seas began to stagnate. Ocean circulation relies on temperature differences between surface and deep water. As global heat increased, These differences weakened. Warm water layered atop warm water, preventing mixing. Oxygen could no longer reach deeper zones. Vast regions of the seafloor became suffocating deserts. In these areas, something unusual appeared. Bacteria that thrive without oxygen began dominating. Some produced toxic hydrogen sulfide gas as a byproduct. Normally, this gas remains trapped in deep sediments. But as low oxygen zones expanded, the gas crept upward into shallower water, poisoning marine life. Shell-forming organisms were among the first victims. Their fossils abruptly cease in many regions at the same geological level. On land, the effects mirrored the oceans. Heat waves intensified year after year. Large animals required stable food supplies and ample water. Yet, drought cycles lengthened. Juveniles struggled to reach maturity. Populations declined not through sudden death, but through generations failing to replace themselves. Even insects, famously resilient, faced crisis. Certain lineages nearly vanished entirely from the record. This is extraordinary, because insects have survived nearly every environmental change Earth has experienced. Their collapse signaled that the disturbance had reached fundamental levels of the biosphere. The air itself was changing. Carbon dioxide concentrations increased, trapping more heat. Warmer temperatures accelerated chemical weathering, altering soils and nutrient cycles. Plants that once regulated atmospheric balance could no longer keep pace with the changes. The planet was drifting toward conditions unfamiliar to complex life. Yet, there was no single moment anyone could call the disaster. For tens of thousands of years, life clung to survival. Each generation adapted slightly, migrated slightly, endured slightly harsher seasons. If intelligent observers had existed, they might have debated whether the changes were temporary. After all, the Earth had changed before. But the pace was accelerating. At a certain point recorded in sediment layers worldwide, extinction rates surged dramatically. Species that had survived previous hardships disappeared within a relatively brief geological interval. Marine ecosystems collapsed first, followed closely by terrestrial ones. The fossil diversity curve drops so sharply that it resembles a cliff. Afterward comes something haunting. Rock layers immediately above the extinction boundary contain remarkably few fossils, not merely new species replacing old ones, but near emptiness. This interval is sometimes called the coal gap, because coal-forming forests vanished. Without dense vegetation, peat could not accumulate. For a span of millions of years, the Earth lacked the lush ecosystems required to create major coal deposits. The world became sparse. Surviving animals were typically small, hardy, and generalist. Instead of complex food webs, ecosystems resembled emergency communities built from whatever endured. In many places, microbial mats dominated shorelines where diverse marine life once flourished. The planet looked biologically young again, despite its great age. What caused such devastation remained unknown for decades. No impact crater of appropriate size existed. No evidence suggested a nearby supernova. The destruction appeared internal, tied to processes unfolding deep within the Earth itself. Geologists studying Siberian rock formations eventually uncovered a clue. There existed immense layers of solidified lava covering an area larger than many modern countries. These formations dated precisely to the time of the extinction. They represented not a single eruption, but continuous volcanic activity lasting hundreds of thousands of years. The implications were profound. The catastrophe was not a moment, but a prolonged planetary fever. The Earth had entered a state where its own geology altered atmosphere, oceans, and climate simultaneously. Instead of one lethal blow, life faced a cascade of interconnected crises, each amplifying the next. By the end of this interval, more than 9 out of every 10 species that had lived were gone. Entire evolutionary lineages erased. Recovery would take millions of years, and the ecosystems that emerged would be unlike those before. In the next chapter, we return to the world before the disaster reached its peak and explore the thriving ecosystems of late Permian Earth, a planet rich with life, unaware that the greatest extinction in history had already begun. Long before the silence, Earth was a crowded place. 252 million years ago, the planet looked unfamiliar, yet it was not empty or primitive. Life had already been evolving for more than 3 billion years, and by the late Permian period, ecosystems were intricate and stable. Creatures filled nearly every available niche, from the deepest ocean basins to the harsh interior deserts of a vast supercontinent called Pangaea. All land on Earth was joined together. From pole to pole stretched a single immense continent surrounded by a global ocean. The interior of Pangaea was dry and extreme, with scorching summers and cold winters far from moderating coastal waters. Along its margins, however, rivers carved fertile plains where forests flourished. Seasonal rains fed wetlands dense with vegetation. These forests were unlike modern ones. There were no flowering plants, no grasses, and no birds. Instead, tall conifers, seed ferns, and strange scale-barked trees dominated the landscape. Their leaves were tough and adapted to conserve water. Thick roots stabilized soils in floodplains. Fallen trunks accumulated in swamps, building organic layers that would one day become fossil fuels buried deep underground. Among the plants moved a diverse assembly of animals that do not fit easily into modern categories. Some resembled reptiles, but possessed features later associated with mammals. Others were heavy-bodied herbivores with barrel chests designed for digesting fibrous vegetation. Predators stalked them with powerful jaws and differentiated teeth, early experiments in evolutionary design that would eventually lead to warm-blooded creatures. One of the dominant herbivores was a group of animals called dicenodonts. They had beaked mouths, stout limbs, and sometimes tusks. Herds likely roamed river valleys, feeding on tough plant matter. Their abundance suggests they formed the foundation of terrestrial food webs. Predators included gorgonopsians, sleek carnivores with elongated canine teeth. Though not related to later saber-toothed mammals, they occupied a similar ecological role. Their bodies were built for pursuit, and their senses were refined for hunting across open terrain. The world was balanced. Insects buzzed through the air and crawled through leaf litter. Amphibians lurked in waterways, some reaching enormous sizes compared to modern relatives. Reptile-like creatures laid eggs in sandy banks warmed by the sun. Life had spread into stable cycles shaped by climate patterns that had persisted for millions of years. The oceans were even richer. Warm, shallow seas covered large continental shelves around Pangaea's edges. Coral reefs built massive underwater structures inhabited by countless species. Brachiopods anchored to the seafloor in dense colonies. Trilobites, survivors from far older ages, still crept along sediments. Ammonoids, with coiled shells, drifted through open water alongside fish of many forms. Predators swam among them. Some fish possessed crushing teeth for breaking shells, others had streamlined bodies for speed. Marine reptiles had not yet risen to dominance, leaving oceans ruled by a mixture of ancient lineages that had coexisted for tens of millions of years. To a casual observer, the late Permian world might have appeared permanent. Extinctions had occurred before, but life always recovered and diversified. The biosphere was resilient, shaped by cycles of change too slow for any creature to perceive within a lifetime. Yet hidden beneath this stability were conditions that made the planet vulnerable. Because all continents were joined, ocean circulation differed drastically from today. Currents moved slowly around the massive landmass. Heat distribution was uneven, producing extreme seasonal climates inland and warm, stagnant waters in some coastal regions. Ecosystems adapted precisely to these conditions, meaning sudden changes would have widespread consequences. Carbon moved through the environment in delicate balance. Plants absorbed atmospheric carbon dioxide and stored it in tissues and soils. Oceans dissolved large quantities within their waters. Volcanic activity released additional. Life, however, continued to flourish. In floodplains, young animals matured quickly under favorable conditions. Fossilized burrows suggest complex behaviors, including nesting and parental care in certain species. Tracks preserved in sediment indicate migrations following seasonal vegetation growth. These were not struggling ecosystems, but thriving communities. The seas reflected similar prosperity. Reefs expanded across continental shelves. Layers of shell debris accumulated into thick limestone deposits. Diversity was high enough that paleontologists today can identify precise environmental conditions based on fossil assemblages alone. This level of complexity requires long stability, and for millions of years, stability endured. Nothing in this world prepared its inhabitants for what was beginning deep underground. Far to the north, beneath what is now Siberia, molten rock was gathering within Earth's mantle. Pressure slowly built over immense spans of time. Crustal weaknesses widened. The planet's interior was approaching a release of energy beyond any volcanic activity seen in human history. No animal sensed it. Earthquakes were minor and infrequent at first. Occasional lava flows may have appeared as ordinary geological events. But beneath the surface, a system was forming that would alter atmosphere and oceans together. For now, the Permian world lived in its peak abundance, every niche filled, every food chain connected, every ecosystem mature. It was the culmination of hundreds of millions of years of evolution, and it stood on the edge of disappearance. In the next part, we examine the early environmental disturbances that began altering this stable world long before the final collapse became visible in the fossil record. At first, the changes were easy to ignore. In a world measured by seasons and lifetimes, the earliest warning signs unfolded too slowly for any creature to recognize. A herd of herbivores might notice a river running lower than usual during one summer. A coastal reef might experience a season of unusual warmth. A predator might travel slightly farther to find prey. Each event felt local, temporary, and ordinary. But across the planet, these small disturbances were happening at the same time. Geological records show that toward the end of the Permian period, climate patterns began drifting away from long-standing stability. Carbon isotopes preserved in rock layers indicate a gradual increase in greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. This meant global temperatures were rising, though slowly enough that ecosystems attempted to adjust rather than collapse immediately. The interior of Pangaea responded first. Already prone to dryness, its vast deserts expanded outward. Seasonal rains weakened. River systems shrank or became intermittent, declined in size before disappearing entirely. Juveniles had lower survival rates during prolonged droughts. Large animals require steady food intake, and unstable plant growth disrupted breeding cycles. Over generations, fewer individuals reached adulthood, thinning herds without sudden die-offs. Predators followed the same pattern. Instead of dramatic starvation events, hunting ranges expanded. Tracks preserved in sediment layers show longer travel distances between watering sites. Some carnivores began targeting different prey than before, evidence that preferred species had become rare. The balance between hunter and hunted was weakening. Along the coasts, a different transformation was underway. Ocean temperatures were rising as the atmosphere trapped more heat. Warm water holds less dissolved oxygen than cold water, and this began altering marine habitats. Shallow seas that once circulated freely became layered, with warmer surface water preventing mixing with cooler depth. Marine organisms sensitive to oxygen levels reacted immediately. Brachiopods and certain shelled animals retreated into narrower zones where conditions remained tolerable. In fossil beds from this time, their geographic ranges shrink noticeably. Diversity did not vanish yet, but communities grew less varied and more fragile. Coral-like reef builders struggled as well. Reefs depend on precise chemical balances in seawater. Even small changes in acidity or temperature can slow their growth. Late Permian reef structures show irregular development, interrupted layers suggesting repeated environmental stress. Some colonies died back and regrew multiple times, signs of a system attempting to survive ongoing disturbance. Meanwhile, microscopic life was shifting in composition. Microorganisms form the base of oceanic food webs, and their response to environmental change often precedes larger organisms. Certain bacteria capable of living in low oxygen conditions began appearing more frequently in sediment records. This indicated that some marine environments were already losing oxygen long before mass extinction levels were reached. On land, soils were changing too. Increased temperatures, accelerated chemical weathering, altering nutrient cycles. Plants that depended on specific mineral balances struggled. Pollen records show a gradual replacement of diverse plant communities by fewer hardy species tolerant of heat and dryness. Forests became less dense and more uniform, yet life persisted. The biosphere has endured countless fluctuations across geological time. Temporary warming events and regional droughts were not unprecedented. For thousands of years, ecosystems adapted and rebalanced. Each generation inherited a slightly altered world, but continued functioning. What made this period different was continuity. The disturbances never fully reversed. Each recovery was incomplete before the next shift began. A reef regrew smaller than before. A forest returned thinner. A species recovered in one region but vanished in another. Over time, these partial recoveries accumulated into long-term decline. Then the oceans began to suffocate. As warming intensified, deep waters lost oxygen entirely in expanding regions. Without circulation, organic materials sinking from surface life decomposed slowly, consuming remaining oxygen. Anoxic zones spread across seafloors, leaving only microorganisms capable of surviving without it. In these environments, bacteria produced hydrogen sulfide gas. This gas is toxic to most complex life. Normally trapped beneath sediments, it began leaking into surrounding water. Evidence of this appears in mineral formations associated with sulfur-loving bacteria preserved in late Permian rocks worldwide. The poison was rising. Fish and shelled organisms were among the earliest victims. Many species disappear from fossil layers gradually during this interval, not all at once, but steadily enough to mark irreversible change. Predators dependent on them soon followed. Entire marine food webs began unraveling from the bottom upward. On land, the heat intensified further. Tree growth rings preserved in fossil wood show stress patterns indicating prolonged harsh seasons. Some years produced almost no growth at all. Seeds failed more often. Swamps shrank, eliminating habitats for amphibians and aquatic reptiles. With fewer wetlands, breeding grounds disappeared. Still, extinction had not reached its peak. For tens of thousands of years, the Earth existed in a deteriorating equilibrium. Life endured, but with reduced diversity. Ecosystems functioned, yet lacked resilience. Each environmental shock now carried greater consequences because fewer species remained to stabilize interactions. At this stage, the world was vulnerable. A single additional pressure could transform slow decline into catastrophic collapse. Deep beneath northern Pangaea, that pressure was building. Magma accumulated across a vast region, stretching the crust thinner with every passing millennium. The planet's interior heat, long contained, was nearing release on a scale beyond ordinary volcanism. The surface world remained unaware. Animals grazed sparse vegetation. Reefs clung to survival in warming seas. Forests endured unpredictable climates. Life still existed across land and ocean, though weakened and simplified. Then the ground in the far north began to split. In the next chapter, we follow the emergence of the immense volcanic eruptions that would push the planet beyond recovery and turn gradual crisis into the most devastating extinction in Earth's history. Next. The first eruptions were not extraordinary. Across geological time, volcanoes are common. Mountains split and lava flows across the land in cycles that rarely threaten life on a global scale. When the ground first cracked in the far north of Pangaea, it likely resembled countless eruptions before it. Molten rock poured from long fractures in the crust, spreading across barren terrain and cooling into dark stone. Nothing living nearby could survive, but the world beyond remained unchanged. Yet, these eruptions did not stop. Instead of isolated volcanoes rising and fading, the crust opened along enormous fissures stretching hundreds of kilometers. Lava did not form a single mountain. It formed sheets, layer upon layer, flooding valleys and burying landscapes beneath molten rock. Each flow hardened, only to be covered by another. This region is known today as the Siberian Traps. The name comes from a word meaning steps, describing the vast stair-like plateaus created by successive lava layers. But during the late Permian, it was not a plateau. It was an active wound in the Earth's surface, releasing unimaginable quantities of magma. The scale defies ordinary volcanic comparison. Modern eruptions may last days or months. These lasted hundreds of thousands of years. Lava covered an area larger than many modern countries combined. Rivers of molten rock advanced across forests and plains, incinerating everything in their path. Yet, the immediate destruction near the eruptions was not what doomed the planet. It was the gases. Magma rising through the crust interacted with underground deposits of carbon-rich rock. As the molten material forced its way upward, it heated coal beds and organic sediments, releasing enormous volumes of carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere. Each eruption acted not only as a lava flood, but as a massive atmospheric injection. Greenhouse gases accumulated faster than natural systems could absorb them. At first, temperatures rose modestly. But as eruptions continued, the warming accelerated. Ice-free regions grew hotter, and even polar areas experienced climates far milder than before. Seasonal extremes intensified. Droughts lengthened and storms became erratic. The atmosphere itself began changing character. Volcanic gases also included sulfur dioxide. In the short term, this created atmospheric haze and acid rain. Forests downwind of the eruptions would have endured repeated chemical stress as precipitation damaged leaves and soils. Freshwater systems became acidic, affecting plants and animals dependent on stable conditions. These processes occurred repeatedly over immense spans of time. Unlike a single catastrophe, the eruptions formed a continuous assault. Each century brought new flows, new emissions, and new environmental pressures. Life had no opportunity to recover because the disturbances never ended. In the oceans, warming accelerated the loss of oxygen. Surface waters heated further, strengthening stratification and preventing mixing. Deep waters became vast anoxic zones where only specialized bacteria survived. Hydrogen sulfide production increased, and in some areas the toxic gas may have reached the surface, poisoning marine ecosystems directly. Fossil evidence records sudden disappearances during peak volcanic phases. Marine species that had endured earlier environmental stress now vanished entirely. Entire reef communities collapsed without recovery. Shelled organisms that required stable chemistry could no longer form protective structures as ocean acidity increased. On land, the consequences were equally severe. Higher temperatures increased evaporation rates, intensifying drought across Pangaea's interior. Rivers shrank or disappeared seasonally. Plant communities adapted to moderate climates died back, replaced temporarily by sparse vegetation tolerant of heat. Herbivores faced food shortages that extended across generations. Predators followed the decline of prey. Trackways become rare in sediment layers dating to this interval. Where footprints remain, they often belong to smaller animals, suggesting that large species struggled most under the harsh conditions. Body size reduction is a common response to limited resources, and fossil remains confirm a trend toward smaller surviving forms. The sky itself may have appeared dim. Particles released during eruptions scattered sunlight, creating hazy conditions even as greenhouse gases trapped heat. Daylight could have looked filtered through a persistent veil. Plants dependent on consistent sunlight cycles experienced additional stress beyond temperature alone. The biosphere was being pressured from every direction at once. Heat, drought, acidity, low oxygen, and toxins interacted together. No single factor explains the extinction. Instead, the volcanic activity triggered a chain reaction, each environmental change amplifying the next. The Earth had entered a feedback loop, and it was accelerating. Geochemical records show rapid spikes in carbon levels corresponding to peak eruption phases. These spikes align with sharp drops in biodiversity preserved in fossil layers worldwide. The correlation is clear. As the eruptions intensified, life declined toward collapse. Still, extinction was not instantaneous. For a time, scattered refuges remained where conditions were tolerable. Higher latitudes and certain coastal environments sheltered remnant populations. These survivors represent the last holdouts of ecosystems millions of years in the making. But the eruptions continued. With every new lava flow and every release of gas, the stability of the planet weakened further. The slow crisis that began with subtle climate shifts had become a planetary transformation, driven by forces deep within the Earth. In the next part, we follow how these volcanic processes pushed oceans beyond survivable limits, turning vast regions into toxic waters and initiating the final collapse of marine life. The oceans were the first to truly fail. On the surface, they still moved as they always had. Waves rose and fell, tides followed the pull of the moon, and shorelines remained familiar. But beneath that appearance, the chemistry of seawater was transforming into something hostile to complex life. As volcanic gases accumulated in the atmosphere, global temperatures climbed further. Warmer air heated the upper layers of the oceans, and with heat came stratification. Normally, cold, dense water sinks while warmer water rises, allowing oxygen to circulate from surface to depth. Now that circulation weakened. The deep ocean began to suffocate. Oxygen levels declined across enormous regions of the seafloor. Organisms that depended on it slowed, weakened, and died. Their bodies settled into sediments where decomposition consumed what little oxygen remained. Each death worsened conditions for those still alive. This process created expanding anoxic zones, underwater deserts devoid of most animal life. In these suffocating waters, microorganisms adapted to low oxygen thrived. Certain bacteria used sulfur compounds instead of oxygen in their metabolism. As their populations expanded, they released hydrogen sulfide gas as waste. The gas accumulated first in deep layers, invisible but lethal. Eventually it rose. When hydrogen sulfide reaches higher water levels, it poisons marine animals by disrupting cellular respiration. Fish, mollusks, and arthropods exposed to it lose the ability to extract energy even if oxygen is present. Fossil records from this period show abrupt disappearances of entire marine communities, consistent with widespread toxic exposure rather than gradual starvation alone. Coral reef ecosystems collapsed almost entirely. Reefs require clear, oxygen-rich, chemically stable water. Late Permian reefs display a final phase where growth stops abruptly. After that layer, there is nothing resembling a reef for millions of years. The organisms that built them did not relocate or evolve quickly. They simply vanished. Ocean acidity also increased. Carbon dioxide dissolves in seawater, forming carbonic acid. As atmospheric carbon rose due to continuous eruptions, the oceans absorbed large amounts. This reduced the availability of carbonate ions needed by shelled organisms to build protective structures. Shells became thinner and malformed in the final fossil layers before disappearance. Many species died not from heat or poison directly, but from inability to grow. Larval stages failed to form proper shells, leaving them vulnerable. Populations declined generation by generation until none remained. These subtle failures compounded the direct toxic effects already spreading through the water. Even open ocean swimmers were not spared. Ammonoids, once abundant and diverse, suffered massive losses. Fish diversity fell sharply. Predator and prey relationships collapsed simultaneously because the entire food chain depended on microscopic plankton sensitive to chemical balance. When plankton populations fluctuated wildly, everything above them destabilized. Shorelines turned into graveyards. In some regions, fossil beds contain dense layers of dead shells deposited over short intervals, suggesting sudden die-offs. Above these layers, sediments hold almost no marine fossils at all. The seas did not merely change inhabitants, they became largely empty. The release of hydrogen sulfide may have reached the atmosphere in certain areas. If this occurred, coastal land environments would have experienced toxic air episodes. Evidence from rock chemistry suggests brief intervals where conditions could have harmed terrestrial organisms directly. Though temporary, repeated exposure added stress to ecosystems already weakened by heat and drought. Photosynthetic life in the ocean struggled as well. Hazy skies reduced sunlight penetration into surface waters. Combined with chemical imbalance, this limited plankton productivity. With less primary production, the energy base supporting marine ecosystems diminished further. Starvation spread through species not directly killed by toxins. The extinction rate accelerated dramatically. Within a relatively short geological period, most marine species disappeared. Groups that had survived hundreds of millions of years ended permanently. The ocean, birthplace of complex life, became hostile to its own creations. And when the oceans fail, the land cannot remain stable. Marine environments regulate atmospheric gases and climate patterns. As they collapsed, atmospheric carbon increased even more rapidly. The greenhouse effect intensified, pushing temperatures higher across continents. What began as an oceanic crisis expanded into a planetary one. Terrestrial ecosystems now faced conditions beyond their evolutionary experience. The world approached its tipping point. In the next chapter, we follow the catastrophe onto land, where rising heat, failing vegetation, and collapsing food chains transformed the continents into environments nearly incapable of supporting complex life. As the oceans deteriorated, the continents followed. For millions of years, the land ecosystems of Pangaea had relied on a predictable exchange with the seas. Moisture cycles, atmospheric gases, and temperature regulation were all linked to the health of the oceans. Once those systems faltered, the climate across the supercontinent shifted rapidly toward extremes. Temperatures rose beyond seasonal variation. In many regions, average conditions became hotter than the warmest summers of earlier ages. Heat waves were no longer occasional events, but persistent states lasting generation after generation. Animals adapted for warm climates found themselves pushed beyond physiological limits. Even at night, the air offered little relief, preventing recovery from daily stress. Water sources dwindled. Rivers dependent on regular rainfall became unreliable, alternating between sudden floods and prolonged absence. Wetlands evaporated. Shallow lakes shrank into mineral flats. Fossilized sediments from this time contain extensive evaporite deposits, evidence of intense evaporation under high heat. Plant life was the first to collapse on a large scale. Forests require consistent water availability and stable temperatures. Under relentless drought, many tree species failed to reproduce successfully. Seed production declined. Saplings withered before maturity. Over time, mature forests died without replacement, leaving open landscapes sparsely covered by hardy vegetation. The disappearance of forests reshaped the environment further. Without roots to anchor soil, erosion increased. Dust storms likely became common across interior regions of Pangaea. Fine particles carried into the atmosphere would have dimmed sunlight while simultaneously altering weather patterns. Soil nutrients washed away during rare heavy rains, preventing rapid plant recovery. Herbivores faced a shrinking food supply. Large plant eaters, once supported by abundant foliage, struggled to find enough nutrition. Their ranges expanded in search of vegetation, increasing energy expenditure while decreasing intake. Fossil evidence shows many species declining gradually before vanishing entirely. Reproduction suffered. Under nutritional stress, animals produce fewer offspring, and those born often fail to survive harsh conditions. Instead of dramatic die-offs, populations faded over successive generations. Entire species could disappear without leaving a mass death layer, only a final absence in younger rocks. Predators experienced delayed collapse. For a time, they survived by preying on weakened herbivores, but as prey numbers fell below sustainable levels, carnivores followed. Trackways in late Permian sediments become scarce and then absent, marking the disappearance of large terrestrial animals across wide areas. Heat also affected physiology directly. Higher global temperatures reduce the efficiency of oxygen transport in many organisms. Combined with declining atmospheric oxygen levels recorded in geochemical data, animals faced respiratory stress even while resting. Activity became dangerous. Endurance vanished. Only creatures capable of low metabolic demands endured. Some adapted by becoming smaller. Body size reduction lowers energy requirements and improves heat tolerance. Fossil remains from post-extinction layers often belong to diminutive survivors compared to their ancestors. This pattern suggests intense environmental pressure favoring minimal resource consumption. Meanwhile, the volcanic eruptions continued far to the north. Each phase injected more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, preventing any cooling period long enough for recovery. Short-term volcanic aerosols may have caused temporary dimming and acid rain, but long-term carbon accumulation dominated the climate, locking the planet into persistent warmth. Fire likely spread across many regions. Dry vegetation combined with lightning storms would have ignited frequent wildfires. Charcoal fragments preserved in sediment layers from this interval support widespread burning. Fires destroyed remaining plant communities and released additional carbon into the atmosphere, reinforcing warming trends. The land was entering a feedback cycle. Loss of vegetation increased heat absorption by darker ground surfaces. Warmer surfaces intensified atmospheric circulation patterns that carried dry air across continents. Every environmental change amplified another, accelerating the transformation from living landscape to hostile terrain. By now, ecosystems were no longer merely stressed, they were collapsing. In the next part, we follow the final stage of terrestrial devastation, where food chains failed completely and only a handful of resilient species endured conditions approaching the limits of complex life. As conditions worsened, survival no longer depended on strength or size. It depended on endurance. The great ecosystems of the late Permian had been built upon complexity. Forest canopies fed herbivores, herbivores fed predators. Countless smaller organisms supported the soil, the water, and the air. But when climate pressure intensified beyond tolerance, That complexity became a weakness. Every specialized relationship became a potential failure point. Food chains began breaking apart. In earlier times, a decline in one species could be balanced by another filling its role. Now, entire layers of the ecological structure vanished together. Plant communities thinned beyond recovery, and herbivores could no longer migrate far enough to compensate. Predator territories expanded until they overlapped barren land. Fossil layers from this interval show sudden gaps where diverse animal remains once existed. Instead of multiple species within a single sediment layer, sometimes only one or two appear, then none at all. The continents were not uniformly empty, but life had become patchy and fragile. Certain regions near higher latitudes retained tolerable climates, slightly longer than equatorial interiors. Small populations gathered around remaining water sources. These refuges represented the last stable habitats, though even they were temporary. As warming continued, safe zones shrank. The atmosphere itself contributed to the crisis. Carbon dioxide levels had risen dramatically, but oxygen levels were declining. Reduced oxygen makes movement exhausting and limits the size animals can attain. Creatures adapted to earlier conditions struggled to remain active. Many likely spent increasing time inactive to conserve energy, reducing feeding and reproduction. Large predators disappeared first from most environments. Without sufficient prey, they could not maintain viable populations. Their extinction removed top-level regulation within ecosystems, allowing some smaller species to increase briefly before environmental stress eliminated them as well. The collapse moved downward through the food web step by step. Burrowing animals gained advantage. Underground environments offered slightly cooler and more stable conditions. Fossilized burrows become more common in the layers following peak extinction, suggesting that survival favored creatures capable of sheltering from surface heat. These survivors were typically small, generalist feeders able to consume varied food sources. Meanwhile, plant life entered a prolonged crisis. After forest die-offs, landscapes were dominated by hardy, low-growing vegetation, but repeated drought and heat prevented full recovery. Pollen records show a long interval where plant diversity remained extremely low. The absence of dense vegetation affected the entire atmosphere by reducing carbon absorption. With less plant cover, erosion intensified. Sediment washed into rivers and coastal waters, further stressing marine environments already suffering from chemical imbalance. Land and sea were now linked in a mutual collapse, each worsening the other's condition. The extinction reached its peak. Across the boundary marking the end of the Permian period, more than 90% of species vanished. Trilobites, survivors of multiple previous extinctions, disappeared entirely. Many ancient coral groups never returned. On land, dominant reptile lineages that had ruled for tens of millions of years ended. For a time, the Earth entered what scientists call the survival interval. Rock layers from this period contain extremely few fossils, and those present belong to simple, hardy organisms. Complex ecosystems were gone. The biosphere resembled an early stage of evolution despite the planet's immense age. Temperatures may have exceeded levels tolerable to most large animals in equatorial regions. Some models suggest conditions approaching those of modern deserts, combined with high humidity, making heat dissipation nearly impossible for many organisms. Under such stress, even well-adapted species could not survive prolonged exposure. Only a few lineages endured. These survivors were not the dominant or impressive creatures of the previous world. They were small, opportunists, capable of rapid reproduction and flexible diets. Their importance lay not in their appearance, but in their persistence. They carried the genetic legacy of complex life through the harshest bottleneck in Earth's history. The planet itself had changed state. Climate, atmospheric chemistry, and ocean circulation differed fundamentally from the stable systems that had existed for millions of years. The extinction was not merely a biological event, but a planetary transformation, reshaping how Earth functioned. And recovery would not be quick. The next chapter explores the strange aftermath of the catastrophe, when life struggled to rebuild across a world stripped nearly bare, and evolution began again from a handful of survivors. After the collapse, the Earth did not immediately recover. Extinction events are often imagined as brief catastrophes followed by quick renewal. The end of the Permian was different. Instead of rapid replacement by new species, the planet entered a prolonged interval where complex ecosystems failed to reappear. For millions of years, life persisted, but only barely. The world became biologically simple. Rock layers deposited immediately after the extinction contain remarkably few fossils, where once sediments held shells, bones, and plant impressions in abundance, they now preserved mostly microbial traces. This was not because life was absent, but because only the simplest forms dominated the environment. Microbial mats spread across shorelines. These layered colonies of bacteria formed thin sheets over wet sediment. In earlier eras, such mats existed mainly in extreme environments where animals could not graze upon them. Now they appeared across vast coastal regions because most grazing organisms were gone. Without predators or disturbance, microorganisms expanded freely. The oceans remained hostile. Deep waters were still depleted of oxygen. In some regions, chemical signatures show persistent anoxia lasting hundreds of thousands of years after the extinction peak. This prevented the rapid return of complex marine animals. Larvae entering such waters would suffocate before maturity. Even surface waters were unstable. Temperature fluctuations and high acidity limited the formation of shells and skeletons. Species that depended on mineral structures struggled to establish lasting populations. Many attempted to recolonize repeatedly, only to vanish again when conditions shifted. On land, the situation was similar. Forests did not return immediately. Instead, the landscape was dominated by sparse vegetation and fungi. Fungal spores appear in unusually high abundance in sediments from this time, suggesting widespread decay of dead plant material. The biosphere was processing the remains of the previous world. Soils were thin and nutrient cycles disrupted. Without stable plant cover, organic matter did not accumulate efficiently. Rainfall washed nutrients away faster than plants could reclaim them. This prevented the re-establishment of dense ecosystems even where climate temporarily moderated. The survivors were small and adaptable. Among animals that endured were certain burrowing herbivores and omnivores capable of feeding on roots, detritus, and microbial growth. Their fossils appear widely distributed, indicating that generalist diets provided the best chance of survival. Specialized feeding strategies had nearly all failed. Marine survivors included a few simple shelled organisms and some fish capable of tolerating low oxygen. They occupied shallow refuges where conditions fluctuated but remained survivable. However, diversity was extremely low compared to pre-extinction oceans. Entire ecological roles remained unfilled for long periods. The climate itself remained unstable. Volcanic activity diminished, but atmospheric carbon levels stayed high, maintaining elevated global temperatures. Recovery requires environmental stability, so evolution can diversify. Instead, the early Triassic world experienced repeated stress, preventing rapid adaptation. This complexity approaching previous levels. Evolution had to rebuild from minimal starting points. Each successful lineage represented a rare victory over conditions still capable of causing renewed collapse. The planet felt young again. Where complex interactions once defined life, simple communities dominated. Energy moved through food webs consisting of few steps. Predation existed but in limited form. The absence of large herbivores allowed vegetation to spread slowly without heavy grazing pressure, yet climate prevented forests from fully stabilizing. Gradually, however, change began. Certain plants, tolerant of heat and dryness, expanded across continents. Their roots stabilized soils and improved nutrient retention. With more consistent vegetation came opportunities for herbivores to increase in number. Small predators followed. In the oceans, oxygen levels slowly improved in some regions. Circulation patterns adjusted as climate moderated slightly. The extinction had permanently altered evolutionary pathways. Many ancient groups would never reappear. The survivors would form the foundation of entirely new ecosystems, unlike those before. In the next part, we explore how these surviving lineages diversified and how the earliest ancestors of future dominant creatures emerged from the shadows of a devastated planet. Recovery did not begin with abundance. It began with persistence. For a long time after the extinction peak, Earth remained a difficult place for complex organisms. Temperatures stayed high, rainfall patterns were unstable, and ocean chemistry fluctuated unpredictably. Any species attempting to expand faced constant setbacks. Yet evolution does not require comfort. It requires only survival long enough for variation to matter. The organisms that endured were not the strongest of the previous world. They were the most flexible. On land, certain small vertebrates proved particularly resilient. Fossil records show that a few burrowing herbivores spread across multiple continents during the early Triassic period. Their success came from simplicity. They could feed on roots, low vegetation, and decaying matter. They required little water compared to larger animals. And when heat intensified, they sheltered underground, where temperatures remained more stable. This behavior protected them from the harsh surface environment. Burrows also provided protection from predators, though predators were scarce. The few carnivores that survived tended to be opportunistic feeders rather than specialized hunters. Instead of relying on a single prey type, they consumed anything available, including carrion. In a devastated ecosystem, adaptability replaced dominance. Body size remained small across most species. Large animals require stable food chains and predictable resources. Those conditions did not yet exist. Fossils from early recovery layers show a repeated pattern known as the Lilliput effect, where organisms following a mass extinction are significantly smaller than their ancestors. Smaller bodies require less energy and reproduce more quickly, improving chances of persistence in unstable environments. Plant communities also changed character. Instead of diverse forests, landscapes were covered by hardy seed plants tolerant of heat and drought. These early colonizers stabilized soil and created the first reliable food supply since the catastrophe. Their spread allowed herbivore populations to increase slowly, which in turn supported more predators. But recovery was uneven. Some regions experienced temporary ecological growth only to suffer renewed collapse when climate fluctuations returned. Sediment layers reveal alternating intervals of increased diversity followed by reductions. The biosphere advanced in hesitant steps rather than a smooth progression. In the oceans, the pattern mirrored the land. Oxygen levels improved gradually in shallow waters first. Here, small marine animals established simple communities dominated by a few species. Shell-forming organisms reappeared, but in low diversity. Fish populations began diversifying again, though still far below former abundance. Reefs did not immediately return. For millions of years after the extinction, reef ecosystems remained absent or extremely limited. The complex symbiotic relationships required to build them took far longer to re-evolve than simple marine communities. The ocean was alive again, but not yet vibrant. Evolution now moved along new pathways. Many dominant Permian groups were gone forever, leaving ecological roles empty. When environments stabilized enough, surviving lineages began adapting into these vacant niches. This process allowed rapid diversification compared to normal evolutionary rates. Among the most significant survivors were certain reptile-like animals with upright limb postures and efficient breathing systems. During the harsh aftermath, these features provided endurance in hot climates. Over time, their descendants experimented with new feeding strategies, locomotion, and body forms. These were not yet dinosaurs, but they were the ancestors of the creatures that would later dominate the planet. The extinction had removed previous rulers and opened ecological space for entirely different designs to succeed. The world was no longer rebuilding the past, it was constructing a future that had never existed before. The atmosphere slowly stabilized as volcanic activity waned. Carbon levels remained elevated, but began a gradual decline as new plant growth absorbed gases. Cooler intervals became more common. Rainfall patterns grew less chaotic. These improvements allowed ecosystems to persist long enough for diversification, rather than constant survival. Food chains lengthened. Herbivores supported specialized predators once again. Aquatic environments developed layered communities from microorganisms to mid-level hunters. Though still simpler than before the extinction, the structure of complex ecosystems was returning. The most important change was time. Recovery from such devastation required millions of years. During this span, evolution reshaped life from the ground up. The organisms that flourished were not restorations of the old Permian world, but pioneers of a different era. By the middle of the Triassic period, the biosphere finally approached stability. The survivors had given rise to new groups capable of exploiting warmer climates. From these lineages would emerge reptiles adapted for speed, endurance, and diverse diets. Soon they would spread across continents. In the next chapter, we follow how these new evolutionary experiments transformed the recovering planet and how the first true dinosaurs arose from a world reborn out of near extinction. By the middle of the Triassic period, the Earth no longer resembled the dying planet that had followed the extinction. Recovery had been slow and uneven, but eventually stability returned long enough for evolution to move beyond mere survival. Ecosystems were still simpler than before the catastrophe, yet they were now connected, layered, and capable of supporting larger animals again. Life was rebuilding, but not by restoring what was lost. Most dominant groups of the Permian never returned. Their ecological roles remained empty for millions of years, waiting for entirely new organisms to fill them. This absence created an unusual opportunity in evolutionary history. Instead of competing against established rulers, emerging lineages encountered open environments with minimal resistance. The continents remained joined as Pangaea, but climates had changed. Although still warm overall, the extreme instability had lessened. Seasonal patterns became more predictable. Vegetation spread across wider regions, forming patchy forests and open woodlands rather than the dense swamps of earlier times. Rivers stabilized into lasting channels, supporting expanding animal populations. Among the most successful animals were a group of reptiles known as archosaurs. They possessed upright postures that held their bodies above the ground rather than sprawling sideways. This improved breathing efficiency and endurance, especially in warm climates where oxygen levels remained somewhat reduced compared to earlier ages. Efficient lungs and strong limbs allowed them to travel farther in search of food and water. At first they were small and cautious. Early archosaurs did not dominate immediately. They lived alongside many other surviving reptiles and amphibians that had also endured the extinction. But their anatomy provided an advantage. In a recovering world where resources fluctuated, endurance mattered more than raw strength. Predators began to specialize again. Instead of generalist scavengers, some species evolved sharper teeth and faster movement suited for active hunting. Herbivores diversified into different feeding heights and plant preferences, forming the early outlines of complex food webs. The structure of ecosystems strengthened year by year. The oceans showed similar renewal. Fish diversified into new forms, occupying midwater and shallow coastal habitats. Shelled organisms returned with thicker structures as ocean chemistry stabilized. Though reefs were still rare, marine communities regained multiple trophic levels, restoring energy flow through ecosystems. The planet was not merely recovering, it was reorganizing. Because the extinction had removed former dominant competitors, evolution experimented rapidly. Features that might have been disadvantageous in the previous world now succeeded. Body plans changed quickly across relatively short geological intervals. Among archosaurs, certain small bipedal species began running on their hind limbs. This posture freed the forelimbs for grasping or balance and increased stride efficiency. At first, these animals were minor components of ecosystems, overshadowed by larger reptilian herbivores and predators. But their agility allowed them to exploit environments others struggled to navigate. Climate still favored mobility. Pangaea's vast interior remained dry compared to coasts. Animals capable of traveling long distances between resources held an advantage. Lightweight skeletons and efficient respiration supported this lifestyle, gradually setting these creatures apart from slower competitors. Over generations, these adaptations intensified. Leg bones lengthened, balance improved through tail adjustments, teeth diversified for different diets. What began as minor variations accumulated into new categories of animal unlike anything before the extinction. These were the earliest dinosaurs. They did not appear suddenly as giants ruling the land. They emerged quietly among many species, small and quick, competing in niches others ignored. Their importance lay not in immediate dominance, but in long-term potential. The extinction had cleared ecological space for them to expand. For millions of years they remained one group among many. But evolutionary momentum was on their side. The world that followed the catastrophe favored endurance, adaptability, and efficient movement, traits central to their design. As climate stabilized further, their populations spread across continents. The rise of dinosaurs was not an isolated event. It was a direct consequence of the Permian collapse. Without the extinction removing previous rulers, these animals may never have gained opportunity to diversify. The disaster had rewritten the rules of survival, and new winners emerged under those rules. In the next part, we follow how these early dinosaurs gradually transformed ecosystems and replaced many surviving lineages, marking the completion of Earth's long recovery from its greatest extinction. At first, dinosaurs were insignificant. In the early Triassic, and even into the middle of the period, they occupied only minor ecological roles. Larger reptilian herbivores still dominated plant consumption, and powerful predators unrelated to dinosaurs controlled many hunting territories. If an observer had lived then, nothing would suggest dinosaurs would one day rule the planet. But evolution favors consistency. The world recovering from the Great Extinction still experienced long, warm seasons and periodic environmental stress. Many older reptile groups retained sprawling limb postures inherited from earlier ages. This required more energy to move and restricted breathing efficiency during sustained activity. Dinosaurs, by contrast, stood upright and moved with a rhythm linked to respiration. This gave them endurance. They could travel farther without exhaustion, pursue prey longer, and survive in habitats where resources were widely spaced. Over thousands of generations, this advantage translated into broader distribution. Fossil sites across multiple continents begin recording similar dinosaur species appearing in distant regions. Mobility reshaped ecosystems. Herbivorous dinosaurs spread into open woodlands where vegetation was patchy. Their feeding habits differed from earlier herbivores, cropping plants at varying heights and reducing competition within their own populations. This allowed several species to coexist rather than exclude one another. Predatory dinosaurs followed. Small bipedal hunters evolved sharper teeth and forward-facing eyes suited for tracking moving prey. They were not yet large, but they were efficient. Instead of overpowering victims through size, they relied on speed and coordination. Packs may have formed in some species, though evidence remains indirect. Meanwhile, many older reptile lineages declined. They were not suddenly wiped out, but gradually replaced as conditions favored animals capable of sustained activity. The difference was subtle year to year, but dramatic over millions of years. Regions once dominated by ancient predators now contained increasing numbers of dinosaur trackways preserved in sediment. Plant life influenced this shift. Vegetation patterns continued evolving under warm global climates. Faster-growing plants supported animals able to move frequently between feeding grounds. Slower, heavy-bodied herbivores lost ground to lighter species capable of migrating seasonally. Dinosaurs fit this requirement well. Oceans experienced parallel change. Marine reptiles unrelated to dinosaurs expanded into ecological roles vacated by extinct Permian groups. Fish diversified further, forming complex predator-prey relationships. For the first time since the catastrophe, global ecosystems displayed stability resembling earlier ages, though composed of entirely new participants. The recovery phase was ending. Where once survival depended on endurance alone, now competition determined success again. In this environment, dinosaurs excelled. Their respiratory systems allowed efficient oxygen exchange even in warmer climates. Their upright limbs supported faster movement with less energy cost. Gradually, they became common rather than rare. Fossil assemblages show increasing proportions of dinosaur remains relative to other reptiles. Trackways multiply in younger sediments. What began as scattered populations grew into dominant communities across large regions of Pangaea. The transformation was complete. Earth had rebuilt itself after near annihilation, but the inhabitants of this renewed world differed profoundly from those before the extinction. The great disaster had not merely pruned life, it had redirected evolution. Within tens of millions of years, dinosaurs would become the primary large animals on land. Mammal ancestors survived in smaller roles, waiting for opportunities far in the future. Every later ecosystem, including those eventually giving rise to humans, depended on this restructuring. The Permian catastrophe did more than destroy a world. It created the conditions for another. In the next chapter, we explore the deeper implications of this transformation and how the extinction reshaped the entire future history of life on Earth. By the time dinosaurs began spreading across Pangaea, the extinction itself was already tens of millions of years in the past. Yet, its influence remained everywhere. Every ecosystem, every dominant lineage, and every evolutionary direction had been shaped by that catastrophe. The world had recovered biologically, but it was no longer the same planet. Extinctions do not simply remove species. They reset possibilities. Before the end Permian event, Earth had been ruled by entirely different forms of life. Mammal ancestors existed, but were overshadowed by larger reptile-like creatures adapted to stable climates. Marine environments were dominated by ancient groups that had persisted since far older ages. Evolution moved slowly because competition was intense and niches were filled. The collapse erased that stability. When 90% of species disappeared, ecological roles across land and sea became empty at the same time. Predator niches, herbivore niches, reef builders, burrowers, swimmers, and scavengers all vanished in overlapping waves. The few survivors did not restore previous systems because they evolved under radically altered environmental conditions. This is why recovery produced unfamiliar ecosystems. Instead of rebuilding old communities, evolution experimented with new body plans and behaviors. Dinosaurs rose not because they were inherently superior, but because previous competitors no longer existed. Marine reptiles expanded for the same reason. Even plants diversified into forms adapted to warmer, drier climates. The extinction redirected evolution's path. If the late Permian world had continued uninterrupted, its dominant creatures would have refined their adaptations further. Mammals might never have gained ecological significance. Dinosaurs may have remained minor reptiles. The later history of life would have been unrecognizable. Geological evidence confirms the permanence of the change. After the boundary marking the extinction, certain fossil groups never reappear. Entire evolutionary experiments ended completely. Others return only in simplified forms before disappearing again. The continuity seen across earlier periods is broken. The biosphere entered a new phase rather than resuming the old one. Climate systems also shifted long-term. High greenhouse gas levels eventually declined, but the planet's atmospheric balance never returned precisely to its previous state. Ocean circulation patterns reorganized. Continental environments evolved under new climate regimes. These altered conditions favored different biological strategies. The extinction therefore acted as both destruction and selection. Traits suited to the former world lost importance. Traits suited to variability and endurance gained value. Efficient breathing, upright posture, flexible diet, and rapid reproduction became advantageous across many lineages. Over millions of years, these characteristics shaped the dominant animals of the Mesozoic era. Even evolutionary pace changed. Following such a large extinction, diversification often accelerates because many niches are vacant. Fossil records from the Triassic show bursts of speciation as organisms adapted into roles once occupied by unrelated predecessors. The rebuilding of biodiversity occurred through innovation rather than restoration. The long recovery also influenced survival strategies. Species descended from survivors tended to tolerate environmental fluctuations better than those of earlier periods. Having passed through extreme conditions, their descendants inherited broader adaptability. This resilience shaped ecosystems that could endure later changes more effectively. The consequences extended into the future beyond dinosaurs. When another extinction eventually ended their dominance, mammals inherited a world already structured by the earlier Permian event. The chain of cause and effect stretched across hundreds of millions of years, linking catastrophes separated by vast time. Thus, the greatest extinction was not just an ending. It was a turning point, dividing two fundamentally different biological eras. Everything after it evolved in a context created by its aftermath. Without it, the familiar story of life, from dinosaurs to mammals to humans, would likely never have unfolded. In the next part, we consider how close the planet came to permanent biological stagnation, and why the survival of a few small organisms prevented the reset of complex life entirely. Looking back across geological time, the most unsettling aspect of the Permian extinction is not the destruction itself, but the margin of survival. Life did not simply decline, it approached failure. When scientists compare fossil diversity before and after the boundary, the drop is so extreme that the biosphere appears nearly erased. In some regions, sediment layers spanning thousands of years contain almost no remains of complex organisms. Not reduced diversity, but near absence. The Earth had not become sterile, yet it stood dangerously near a threshold where recovery might never occur. Complex ecosystems depend on interaction. Predators require prey. Herbivores require vegetation. Plants rely on soils enriched by microorganisms and animals. Remove enough links in this chain and the system cannot rebuild itself. During the peak of the extinction, many of these connections vanished simultaneously across land and sea. The oceans were closest to collapse. Large areas remained anoxic for extended periods, preventing stable communities from forming. Without oxygen circulation, marine food webs could not re-establish beyond simple organisms. Had these conditions persisted slightly longer, complex ocean life might have restarted from microscopic ancestors alone, requiring hundreds of millions of years to redevelop. On land, similar vulnerability existed. With forests gone and soils degraded, plant communities struggled to anchor ecosystems. Animals that depended on vegetation could not expand populations, and without herbivores, predators could not return. The planet hovered in a state where recovery depended on a handful of adaptable species maintaining minimal ecological processes. These species were unremarkable in appearance. Small burrowers, opportunistic feeders, and tolerant microorganisms carried evolutionary continuity through the crisis. They did not dominate their environments, they endured them. Yet their persistence prevented the biosphere from resetting to purely microbial life. Survival required coincidence as much as adaptation. Certain refuges retained tolerable conditions long enough for populations to reproduce. Slightly cooler climates at higher latitudes, localized water availability, and temporary improvements in atmospheric chemistry allowed pockets of life to persist. If volcanic activity had continued at peak intensity longer, even these refuges might have failed. The timing was critical. Geochemical records suggest environmental extremes peaked and then slowly eased. Oxygen levels began gradual improvement. Temperatures stabilized just enough for reproduction to outpace extinction. Recovery did not begin because conditions became favorable, but because they became barely survivable. From this narrow margin, all later life descended. Dinosaurs, marine reptiles, mammals, birds, flowering plants, and eventually humans trace ancestry through those survivors. The complexity of modern ecosystems rests on organisms that, in their own time, represented the final, fragile remnant of a once rich world. This perspective changes the meaning of extinction. The event was not merely the death of species, but a test of whether complex life could persist at all. Earth had experienced large impacts and climate shifts before, yet none approached this level of systemic breakdown. The biosphere endured by the smallest possible margin. The aftermath shaped evolution permanently. Lineages descending from survivors inherited traits suited for resilience. They tolerated heat, fluctuating oxygen, and ecological instability better than many earlier groups. This inheritance influenced later evolutionary successes, including the endurance of mammals through subsequent environmental changes. The world that followed was therefore built on contingency. If a few species had vanished, later ecosystems might never have formed. Another extinction millions of years later might have encountered a planet still dominated by simple organisms. The path toward intelligent life depended on recovery beginning at exactly the right moment. The greatest extinction rarely appears in common memory because it left no dramatic single scar visible today. No vast crater marks its occurrence. Instead, its legacy exists in the continuity of life itself. Every complex organism alive now is evidence that recovery succeeded. In the final chapter, we examine what this event reveals about planetary change and why the history of this ancient catastrophe carries meaning far beyond the distant past. The Permian extinction is separated from the present by hundreds of millions of years, yet its meaning is not confined to ancient history. The rocks that record it are not only archives of death, but records of planetary behavior. They reveal how Earth responds when its systems are pushed beyond balance. The catastrophe did not require an impact from space. It emerged from processes entirely natural to the planet. Volcanic activity altered atmospheric chemistry, atmospheric change transformed climate, climate disrupted oceans, ocean collapse destroyed ecosystems. Each stage amplified the next until the biosphere could no longer stabilize itself. This chain reaction is the most important lesson. Complex life depends on equilibrium among geological, chemical, and biological systems. No single factor ended the Permian world. Instead, many smaller pressures combined and reinforced each other. Heat increased water loss reduced vegetation increased carbon in the atmosphere, increased carbon warmed the oceans, and the cycle intensified. The extinction demonstrates thresholds. For long periods, environmental stress produced only gradual decline. Species adapted, migrated, or diminished, but ecosystems persisted. Then a tipping point was crossed. After that moment, recovery processes reversed. Instead of stabilizing change, they accelerated collapse. Geological layers record this clearly. Carbon isotope ratios shift rapidly during peak volcanic phases. Oxygen indicators in marine sediments fall sharply. Fossil diversity drops in synchrony across continents. The alignment of independent evidence shows a system passing from resilience into runaway transformation. Recovery required immense time. Millions of years passed before complex ecosystems returned, and even then they differed fundamentally from those before the extinction. This indicates that planetary-scale disruptions outlast the events that caused them. Volcanic eruptions slowed, yet climate and oceans remained unstable long afterward. The biosphere does not simply rebound, it reorganizes. Life adapts to new conditions rather than restoring old ones. The rise of dinosaurs illustrates this principle. They were not survivors of the Permian world, but beneficiaries of its removal. Evolution responded to altered environments by creating different ecological structures. The extinction also reveals limits of adaptation. Many species survived earlier environmental changes, but failed during this event because the rate and combination of changes exceeded biological flexibility. Adaptation operates over generations. When change accumulates faster than reproduction and selection can respond, extinction follows regardless of previous success. Earth itself survived. The planet continued orbiting, oceans remained, and life persisted. But survival of the planet and survival of its complex inhabitants were separate outcomes. Geological processes care nothing for biological continuity. From Earth's perspective, the extinction was transformation, not catastrophe. From life's perspective, it was nearly final. Understanding this distinction matters because it shows that habitability can decline without planetary destruction. Conditions compatible with microbes may remain while larger organisms vanish. The Permian event approached this state before recovery began. The rock record therefore acts as a warning written long before observers existed to read it. It shows that stability is temporary and dependent on balance. When feedback cycles reinforce disturbance instead of correcting it, the consequences extend across millions of years. The greatest extinction did not occur because life was fragile, but because planetary systems can shift into states hostile to complexity. In the final part, we reflect on the long chain connecting that ancient crisis to the existence of modern ecosystems, and consider why its story remains relevant today. Every living creature today exists because the recovery succeeded. The Permian extinction erased most life that had ever evolved up to that point. What remained was a narrow genetic thread carried through a hostile world by small, resilient organisms. From them descended the animals and plants that later filled forests, seas, and skies. The continuity between that devastated planet and the present is direct and unbroken. The disaster shaped the entire future. Dinosaurs rose because earlier rulers vanished. Mammals survived because they were small and adaptable in harsh conditions. Birds evolved from dinosaur descendants. Flowering plants later diversified within ecosystems structured by those earlier recoveries. The path toward complex intelligence depended on a sequence of opportunities created by absence. Without the extinction, the Earth would still have supported life, but it would have been a different life. Large reptile-like creatures dominant in the late Permian might have continued refining their ecological control. Mammals may never have left marginal habitats. The conditions required for primates and eventually humans might not have emerged. Evolution does not aim towards specific outcomes. It follows available pathways, and the extinction changed those pathways permanently. The event also demonstrates the scale of planetary memory. Although hundreds of millions of years have passed, modern ecosystems still carry structural patterns inherited from that recovery. The distribution of major animal groups, the dominance of certain plant types, and the adaptability of surviving lineages all trace back to traits favored in the aftermath. The present biosphere is partly a legacy of a boundaries crossed. For long intervals, the late Permian world appeared stable despite accumulating stress. When collapse came, it unfolded across timescales too long for individuals to perceive, yet rapid in geological terms. Life could not adapt quickly enough once multiple feedback loops reinforced change. Recovery required millions of years. From a human perspective, this is effectively permanent. A biosphere can rebuild, but not within the span of civilizations or even species' lifetimes. The persistence of life does not guarantee the persistence of familiar environments. The Permian world was replaced, not restored. In that sense, the extinction was both ending and beginning. It ended an ancient biological era and opened another that eventually led to the modern world. The forests, animals, and climates known today exist because evolution restarted from a nearly empty stage. The catastrophe did not erase life entirely, but it determined which forms of life would shape the future. The rocks recording this event remain across every continent. They preserve the moment when Earth approached losing complex ecosystems and narrowly retained them. Each fossil above the boundary represents recovery. Each layer below represents a vanished world. Together they show continuity balanced against vulnerability. The greatest extinction is rarely remembered because it lacks a single dramatic instant. No one moment defines it. Instead, it was a process, a long transformation driven by interconnected changes. Its significance lies in how close the biosphere came to failing and how profoundly the survivors altered everything that followed. Human existence is part of that aftermath. The chain linking present life to those small survivors extends across deep time without interruption. The modern world is not separate from that ancient crisis, but a consequence of it. The catastrophe no one witnessed determined the conditions under which observers would one day appear. Earth endured, life endured, but it did so by becoming something entirely new.